On this episode of China Unscripted, protests across the U.S. over the death of George Floyd are being exploited by China's propaganda machine. Here's how. Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Ganeshta.
And tonight we're going to be talking about the only news that is in the news, the protests surrounding George Floyd. No, this is not an America Uncovered podcast. That would be way too much work for us to do. But specifically, the ones who have been really celebrating this story is the Chinese Communist Party, who have managed to turn a national tragedy into a propaganda line for their own benefit. I
think that's being a little unfair.
To whom?
The Chinese Communist Party.
And why?
Well, it's not really that they're using this particular incident more than other incidents. It's just part of what they've been doing all along. But this is just giving them a lot more fodder.
Well, yes, that is true. The Communist Party uses propaganda all the time.
Not just, but like the particular tactics they use related to how they're talking about the George Floyd protest.
Well, yeah, going back to the 1960s under Mao Zedong, they were using this, their propaganda focusing on like racial tensions in the United States, as well as portraying the United States as a dangerous, unsafe place. But just because they've been doing it for decades doesn't mean it doesn't work.
Well, I think it actually does work.
That's what I said.
You two.
Is that
Continue.
what he said?
Look, the point is, it's working. The Chinese Communist Party has had for decades, this continuous strategy of highlighting racism and various problems in the U.S. and using them as propaganda lines. And I think the Chinese propaganda has gotten more sophisticated over the years. I mean, Chinese propaganda now is much more subtle and sophisticated than it was, 20 years ago.
I mean, they can use Twitter now.
That's right. Of course, I mean, you can't use it in China.
That's really recent, though. Like, they have only been using Twitter. Well, I mean, Chinese state-run media have been using Twitter for a few years, but you see Hua Chunying or Zhao Lijian or they on Twitter.
I mean, when I think of
sophistication,
sophistication, I think of Twitter.
Yes, that's where you put, your complex ideas on Twitter. Mm-hmm. Like how Hua Chunying, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson, said, she tweeted, "I can't breathe."
Well, in particular, that was in response to a U.S. State Department spokesperson who was talking about the Hong Kong protests and the erosion of freedoms in Hong Kong.
I do have to say that was, whoever runs Hua Chunying's Twitter account, that was like a good grasp of how to use Twitter. Because it's like, it's not actually about making like a cogent argument necessarily. It's about owning the person you're quote tweeting. Mm-hmm. So that was good.
Actually, this reminds me of something Joshua Phillips, who we had on the show recently, said about propaganda. The propaganda is not necessarily untrue. It just makes you have an emotional reaction. And I think that's very much what happens, with Chinese propaganda, but also how Twitter is used in general.
Are you saying Twitter is propaganda?
I'm saying emotions are propaganda.
Ah, okay.
I think
we should just get rid of emotions.
That's what I say. It's illogical.
Yes, I also agree with that. Oh, come on. But the point is that now I've completely lost my train of thought. So Twitter is not the place to make cogent arguments. It's the place to own people.
I mean, there are people who make valid arguments on Twitter.
I know, but
you have to read
the whole thing,
thread,
right?
And I don't want that.
Oh, like how terrible it was to read actual news articles and things like that.
I mean, the layout of a news article is very different than a tweet thread.
That's true.
Also, reading is very difficult. That's why we do all our stuff on TV and YouTube.
Yeah, it's not like any of us have to read in order for that to happen.
Look at you with your pen and paper.
Yeah, I'm going old school today. I do feel that you think differently though when you're writing versus when you're texting or typing something.
I think best while I'm texting and driving.
Moving on.
I do want to go back to something you said though about the propaganda not necessarily being untrue. Because I think what you see if you kind of dissect the way that Chinese propaganda works from Chinese state media articles and things like that is that they kind of use accurate facts. Like they use facts to then kind of build up this narrative that is on the whole a lie or misleading in some way. So like if you took out of context each individual fact, nothing they say is untrue, but then they build up this overall thing that is a lie.
Well, I think what's very interesting about in particular the Hua Chunying tweet about "I can't breathe." Obviously, there's nothing factually untrue about that, but it lets.
You mean I don't know? Could she breathe at the time?
I don't know. Okay,
She put it in quotation marks, Shelley. Quotation marks.
Okay, so she was quoting George Floyd
Yeah,
or
that's right.
the protesters in general who talk about that.
Yes.
Yeah, and so there's no statement there, and that lets the viewer fill in the blanks with their own mind. It makes the person who's seeing this tweet fill in the blanks of what the Communist Party propaganda department wants, that when the U.S. talks about protests in Hong Kong, they are being hypocritical because there are protests in the United States. So that's what's interesting about that tweet. It never says, unlike a Global Times article that will call out, that will say, the U.S. is hypocritical. This makes you come to that conclusion yourself.
True. I don't think that's different necessarily, though, than how social media works in general. But
Right, but when the Chinese state-run media uses it, like it's powerful when they do it the so-called right way.
one thing that I did see about that tweet is like a lot of like China journalists retweeting it. And it's not, it's kind of not clear if it was kind of like, well, she has a point, or just like showing how they were using the propaganda.
Well, speaking of having a point, Chinese state-run media also must have felt that tweet was very clever because they started talking about it a lot in Chinese state-run media until Chinese netizens began tweeting or responding, "I can't tweet," since Twitter is banned in China. But,
Hoist on your own petard.
Yes, well, no, they just deleted those comments and everything was fine.
They deleted them from their tweet? Or it was...
No,
the
in social media.
Oh, in Chinese social media.
yeah.
Okay.
So that's
Yeah, that reminds me of how you'll have this weird echo chamber of when Chinese state media, write an article or something. They'll post it on social media, and then the people will comment under that article, and then they will write another article about how much everybody supports like whatever point that they were making in the previous article, using the comments under their article, as support. So this happened, for example, with this is related to the coronavirus, not to the George Floyd protests, but they had an article about how the U.S.'s response to the coronavirus is lackluster. Then, posted it on their Facebook page, like Xinhua's Facebook page, People's Daily's Facebook page, and then used the comments underneath their Facebook page to write a separate article about how everybody agrees that this is the case, which is hilarious because then it's like, yeah, you use the comments from the page that you control and can erase comments that don't agree with you to show how popular your point of view was.
Yeah. And yet, overall, like if you look at what they're doing without thinking about it critically, it does paint a very specific narrative using things that are not technically untrue.
I do, like, one of my favorite recent examples of that is actually something about how they've been building up this narrative over the last few months that maybe the virus came from the U.S.
or France or Italy.
But the U.S. military specifically.
Yeah. So anytime any kind of information comes out that could be interpreted as the virus didn't come from Wuhan, China, they will take that, make an article about it, and then in the article, use all these different previous points. Like, the last one I saw was some New Jersey mayor a few weeks ago sent out a press release claiming that he had the coronavirus in November of last year, based on the fact that he had recently like gotten a physical and gotten the antibody test, and it showed that he had coronavirus antibodies. So he had the coronavirus at some point. And then he himself decided that it must have been last November when he had a bad flu. When he went to some meeting in Atlantic City. And he's like, I've never been so sick in my life. It must have been the coronavirus. And so he then sent out a press release claiming that he had the coronavirus in November. There's no way to know if he had the coronavirus in November. But so that gets picked up in like very local New Jersey media. And then also by Chinese state-run media who blasted on, across their platforms as like New Jersey mayor says he had the coronavirus last November. This is months before the first documented U.S. case of the coronavirus.
And months before we stopped covering it up.
And, just kind of, and then they'll say, oh, and like there were cases, this Italian doctor said that there were cases in Italy in November and December, and, in France, blah, blah, blah. Like California, they showed that, people had the coronavirus like a month before the first documented death. There were deaths from the coronavirus. So all these individual things are true, but none of them actually mean that the coronavirus didn't come from Wuhan. But it
makes you fill in the gaps yourself.
Yeah. It builds it up into this idea that is not really stated, but is there, that like the coronavirus came from somewhere outside China.
Do they point out how there's flu viruses every season and that nobody was testing for the coronavirus in America in November, so that there's no way to know whether any of those cases were the coronavirus versus some other flu?
But there's no way to know that it wasn't the coronavirus.
Checkmate. But really, the protests and the rioting and the looting in the U.S. came at a great time for the Chinese Communist Party. It's like a godsend. Well, they're atheists, so it's a mouse end. Whoa.
Get me out of here.
But yeah, so, there is international condemnation of the Chinese Communist Party covering up the coronavirus. There's the Hong Kong protests. And just the deplorable state that Hong Kong is in because of the Communist Party.
National security law.
National security law, which we've talked about in previous podcasts. This week was the 31st anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre. This is a bad time for the Communist Party, but now they can join the bandwagon of focusing on, they can create this propaganda narrative trying to divert people's attention from all of those things to protests in the U.S., rioting, looting.
How racism is a deeply rooted problem in the U.S. And, that they need to take care of, like, the U.S. before criticizing other countries.
Yeah. And it does create this really weird moral equivalency between what's happening in the U.S. and the Hong Kong protests. It makes it seem as if they're the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I think in that case it's not quite a moral equivalency as because I think
I don't actually know what words mean, so
I do think that they want some kind of moral equivalency in terms of like they want, or moral relativism, I guess is what I'm thinking about, like how if the U.S. can be shown to be bad too, then like when the U.S. criticizes China's human rights situation, like, say locking up 1 million to 2 million people in concentration camps, well, you have racism.
Right. Well, see, this is their warped communist logic, right? The idea that like if you also have done something bad, then you can't criticize anything that I've done that's bad. But if you take this to its logical conclusion, it's like, can a parent who's made mistakes when he was a kid not tell his own son to behave better? Like if we can't, because none of us are perfect. Well, I mean, most people aren't perfect. I'm just saying, like if we can't tell other people that like what they're doing is wrong, then like the entire society will just slide downhill so quickly because everyone will be like, oh, you can't criticize me. But like, of course we should be able to point things out when there are problems. And yeah, we should, look inside and try to, fix our own problems, but that shouldn't be a barrier to pointing out other problems.
I mean, it's not like a prerequisite.
Right. It shouldn't be a prerequisite. But the Communist Party has this warped, idea that they push that, you do have to, get your own house in order before you can ever criticize anybody else. But that means nobody could ever criticize the Communist Party. Like, nobody could say, oh, you're locking up 1 million Uyghurs. It's like, oh, well, America had Japanese internment camps. It's like, come on, like, that should not stop us from being able to say, stop locking up Uyghurs now.
The thing that kind of breaks that, the logic of that is when people then say, yeah, we did have Japanese internment camps. And it was bad.
Did you have a Tiananmen Square massacre?
No.
No.
Like, exactly.
Nothing happened.
So it's like, this kind of reminds me of this, this like internet war that was happening between like Chinese netizens and then like people from Thailand.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the whole Milk Tea Alliance thing where the whole thing was that like these Chinese like internet users thought that they were going to own the Thai internet users by like mocking their government and mocking their king and stuff. And the Thai people were just like, we hate them too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I mean, that's the thing about this. Like in the U.S., like everyone is allowed to freely discuss the death of George Floyd, to be outraged by it. It was discussed on social media, which doesn't exist in China. On the free press, there were, people were constitutionally allowed to gather and protest. None of those things can happen in China.
Right. I mean, free countries like the U.S. have this self-correcting mechanism, which I think is a huge advantage, so that when there are problems in the U.S., because we have First Amendment rights, freedom of speech and assembly, and to petition the government.
We elect our officials so we can,
So
Xi
we can make
Jinping was
change.
elected. Only one vote against.
Yeah. So I mean, obviously Xi Jinping is very popular. But what I'm saying is that this self-correcting mechanism that we have in liberal democracies allows us to, yes, make mistakes, but then quickly point them out and correct them and address them.
Sometimes it's not so quick.
No, and I understand. Look, sometimes things do take time, and they do take people, standing up and protesting and raising awareness. But we're allowed to do that. Like in the U.S., you can have, a TV show that criticizes China, but you can also have one that criticizes the U.S. and our own leadership, right? But in China, you could have a show that criticizes the U.S., but you could never have one that criticizes problems within the Communist Party.
Not within the party. I mean,
Wolf
there can
Warrior.
be sometimes like individual things that happen. Like, remember years ago when a guy died in police custody in China in a prison because he was playing hide and seek? Remember this
Yeah, I
whole
remember
situation?
that. Yeah.
And
Well, just to make that a little clear for anyone listening, this guy mysteriously died in police custody, and the police were like, he died during a game of hide and seek he was playing with the
police.
policemen.
That's what happens in jail.
Right.
Yeah. And it was like a huge deal because this guy wasn't. Something about Chinese society that's kind of ugly that happens because of the authoritarianism of the Communist Party is people have been kind of brainwashed to believe that if you get in trouble with the authorities, it's your fault in some way. So I don't mean like people who rob a bank or something like that. I mean like people who are dissidents and they try to petition the government, which you're legally allowed to do.
That happened to Falun Gong practitioners a lot. That is, if they had just gone underground or stopped being open about it, then they brought it on themselves.
Right. I mean, all dissidents, right?
Yeah.
Like if the human rights lawyers just stopped talking about human rights, if they just didn't try to defend people, like if you kind of keep your head down, like then, so like it kind of makes the society as a whole treat, people who try to make change as troublemakers who kind of deserved it. But this guy who died playing hide and seek, quote unquote, was like a middle class, like average Chinese guy.
Your average Joe.
Yes, your average Joe, who he had been like arrested. The police claimed that he had been arrested like at like a it's part of some prostitution sting at a karaoke bar or something like that, and his family his family were like refuting that that's what happened. But anyway, so he wasn't. But the point is, he wasn't arrested for like speaking out or doing anything, and he was just like a white collar Chinese guy. So that kind of made a huge stink in Chinese society because that was kind of a situation where it was like, oh well, it could happen to anybody.
You kind of saw reflections of that too with the whistleblowing Dr. Li Wenliang, how people were outraged that he had been silenced by the government for trying to, in a small circle, raise awareness about the coronavirus. But then it was interesting to see how the Communist Party then spun that into propaganda that, that happened because of, some bad local officials. But hey, this guy's a hero.
Also, he's a member of the Communist Party.
He's a member of the Communist Party.
Actually, recently, his widow came out on Weibo and like wrote something about how, she's so sad to see, I think there were some U.S. politicians who were talking about naming a street after Dr. Li Wenliang, and his widow was like, Wenliang would not have liked to see this. He was a patriot. He was a member of the Communist Party. He'd be really sad to know that, people were using his name to split the country or something like that.
Wow.
Yeah, so, I mean, I don't know if she, like, sincerely meant that or... Pressure, but, they've also tried to co-opt that story and turn it into propaganda by emphasizing the fact that, like, he definitely was a Communist Party member, which he was, and that, they gave him, like, a posthumous award for being, like, an extraordinary person that came with, like, cash. And kind of like then tried to co-opt his legacy to be like, now this is like the state sanctioned version where he was a hero who spoke out. It was the bad local officials, and also now we're honoring him.
Oh, one thing that comes to mind is, in the U.S. there's been a lot of debate about, who is causing the violence in the protest movement. How there'll be peaceful protests, but then there'll be rioting, looting, and some in the U.S. say, "Oh, that's Antifa." Others will say, those are white supremacists. But the editor-in-chief of the Global Times discovered the truth.
Which is?
It's actually Hong Kong protesters who have infiltrated the U.S. protest movement to cause chaos. Obviously.
They're responsible for the violence.
Isn't it ironic that the U.S. praised those people, and yet now we suffer because of them?
And what proof did he give for the fact
he was on Twitter, and he's the editor-in-chief of the Global Times.
Actually, I think I also saw that tweet, and I think one of the things he did that was clever in that tweet was he said the reason that he thought it was violent Hong Kong protesters that have infiltrated the U.S. is that, they both use the same tactics, breaking shop windows, destroying police stations, like, blah, 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 in a way that equated the Hong Kong protests exactly to the kind of looting and rioting that was going on in the U.S. So while there are some similarities between the protests in Hong Kong and the protests in the U.S., like the level of actual property damage in Hong Kong was not comparable to, I think, what it's been in the U.S. so far. And also in Hong Kong, it was very targeted at either like state symbols in some way, like graffitiing the Chinese like emblem or the Chinese flag. Or
and when they broke into shops, they were targeted to breaking into shops that specifically they felt were pro-Beijing shops.
Yeah, that they thought were
and
that.
They didn't loot the shops; they caused damage to create a message. Now, I'm not saying I agree with that, but there is a difference between specifically targeting government and police buildings and pro-Beijing institutions versus, looting Target and walking out with a bunch of big screen TVs.
I took Legos.
That's justifiable. I'm personally a big Lego fan. That being said, like you do, if you're going to try to compare the two, which obviously the editor-in-chief of Global Times is trying to do, like you have to look at actual comparisons with the things that the groups of protesters are doing.
Remember when the protesters broke into Legco and paid for drinks they took? And
from the canteen, yes.
From the canteen, and made sure not to like damage anything like cultural or nice.
Yeah, I remember that night because we were doing a live broadcast in Hong Kong, and it was...
In retrospect, we should have just gone inside.
Yeah.
At the time, we thought we might be risking our future ability to go to Hong Kong, but joke's on us.
Yeah, we're taken away anyway. But yeah, it's very interesting to like actually compare what is happening in the U.S. with the Hong Kong protest movement, and they're actually not very similar. I know people sometimes try and paint it as the same thing.
Well, I think like it's complicated, right? Because there are Hong Kong protesters who do support the U.S. protests and have been giving advice to U.S.
But
protesters.
they don't support the protest because they consider it the exact same thing as their protest movement.
No, I don't think so. I mean...
Right. I mean, look, I've been to protests in Hong Kong, and I've been to the protests here in New York. And I can say that there are some similarities and there's some differences. For example, like the strategic approach, right? So the strategic approach in Hong Kong was in the beginning, in June, it was withdraw the extradition bill, right? And as the Hong Kong government refused to withdraw it, and then as the police became more violent, that one single demand that had united everybody then turned into 5 demands, right? And there were 5 specific demands which you can lay out. So withdrawal of the extradition bill, independent investigation into the police. Let's see if I can remember all of these. I see the look that you're giving me, like, can Matt remember what they are?
That was kind of also can I remember what they are?
Labeling making sure the protesters are not labeled as rioters, amnesty for the people who've been arrested, and there's one more.
Carrie Lam?
Universal suffrage for Carrie Lam and the Legco.
Yeah, it used to be Carrie Lam resign, but then they stopped.
So they changed
calling for that.
Oh.
So, but what's interesting here is that Hong Kong protesters have been united around a very specific strategic goal with specific demands. And you could ask Hong Kongers what the demands are, and most of them would probably get it a bit faster than me, but they all understand what that is. You know, my experience with the New York protests is like you had such a variety of messaging. You know, there's some protesters had signs that were very specific for, justice for George Floyd. And you had others that were like Black Lives Matter, which is a kind of much, much broader movement that was started in 2013 after the Eric Garner thing, I believe.
Was it Trayvon Martin or Ferguson? No, I can't remember.
No, Ferguson was 2014. Anyway, but the Black Lives Matter movement, I know because I looked it up recently, was 2013. And that the founders of that started it as a radical black social justice movement. And so the goals and strategies and aims of that are different. I'm not sure I can put my finger on what that is because I'm not, an expert on that. But my point is that, if you look at the protests across the country in the U.S., there's so much variety of what people are calling for, from, justice for George
Floyd.
George
Sorry, it's my fault for bringing up Ferguson.
Justice for
It's totally my fault.
They don't have specific policy points.
That's right. They don't have specific policy points. And yeah, I've seen people talk about them on Twitter, but like that's not how the protest movement is. And on top of that, when you look at the way the protests are on the ground, in Hong Kong, you had largely very peaceful protests, and at the end, you have sometimes these conflicts with the police, and you could say yes, there are agitators in Hong Kong.
Oh, definitely.
Who are doing this. In the U.S., you have also largely peaceful protests that then reach the agitation stage.
I have to say, though, when we went to Hong Kong the second time, when there were more like what they call frontliners, like doing things like setting fires or breaking stuff, because when we left in July, it was kind of like not that happening as much as it did later on as like a consistent thing. When we went back in October and September, I realized that a lot of those kind of more aggressive moves were strategic in a way, because they would like set a fire in the middle of the street to distract the cops or bring the firemen in so that then protesters could leave safely. Things like that. So it wasn't just like,
Random fires.
no, usually not. Yeah.
Right. But
Well, there were
also
some,
the first protest last year was June 9th. And the first time that there was vandalism of any kind was July 1st. So there's like 3 weeks gap between like these protests and feeling like things weren't addressed before they broke into LegCo.
I think there was some graffiti before that, but yeah.
Okay. So
Yeah.
so possible. But so in the U.S., it escalated from peaceful protests on like the first day after George Floyd was killed to a lot of, and the police reacted pretty strongly that first day. So I'm not, going to dismiss that. But it was like day 2 of the protests were rioting and looting. It was like immediately that. And none of that was strategic. Like, it wasn't like the protest movement was like, here's what we want to do to get justice for George Floyd, or even here's what we want to do to address systemic racism. Here are the policy points. It's just like, it just kind of devolved very quickly.
Well, I think that, one thing that makes the comparison kind of unfair is the fact that we're trying to compare a city of 7 million people to a country of 328 million people. And there's one overall police force in Hong Kong that is responding in a uniform way. Whereas, like, these protests are happening in dozens of cities across the country. So police in all of these places are responding in different ways. The protesters are protesting in different ways.
Different protests, different police groups.
Different protests, different police, different protest groups. Not everywhere is there rioting and looting. You see that in some of the cities, but somebody was talking about what happened in his small town, where it just ended up being like 300 people protesting through the streets locally, and nobody did anything, and they all had like a barbecue at the end or something like that.
Nice.
So it's,
And I think that the biggest difference is in the United States, it's the rule of law. The officials are duly elected. Hong Kong, it's under the thumb of an authoritarian communist regime. The rule of law is disappearing. They weren't able to elect their main representative, the Hong Kong chief executive. They can't even get representatives into the LegCo anymore after they expelled a bunch of pro-democracy legislators. So it's.
I guess we'll see what happens with the elections in September.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, they tried after the umbrella movement in 2014 kind of failed. They tried to go the way of like just working within the system, and then the Chinese government kept putting more and more pressure so that there was no way to work within the system. But I think, in terms of like the U.S. protesters not having like a coherent like a demand or things like, it's also only been like a week and a half.
Yeah.
So is it possible that the protests here could evolve?
Yeah.
I'm just remembering Occupy Wall Street. I was there when that I was walking by when they marched into Zuccotti Park. And that was a situation where they were there for a long time, and it was an absolute mess. There was so many different groups wanting so many different things. I remember somebody was talking about crystals. There was like the crystal group in there, and it's like, and this went on for a long time, and it never really kind of solidified into anything.
Right. It's interesting to compare Occupy Wall Street actually to the Tea Party movement. Remember that started under Obama? It was like, it was kind of this grassroots, almost a little bit like Occupy, except it was like strategically different, but also because they had a bit more coherent messaging, they also got more funding
From the Koch
from the Koch brothers. So, I mean,
and our channel is shut down on YouTube.
Yeah, no, but I mean, I think that like,
I just gotta say that feels so long ago. I feel like I can't even remember it.
yeah, it is hard when you have all these different groups like coming together, and like there isn't an organizer. Like I brought up Black Lives Matter, and yeah, Black Lives Matter is involved in different degrees in some of the protests in some of the cities. But it's not like Black Lives Matter is like the overall organization for this. And it's not like the protesters all necessarily even agree with the principles of that particular organization, because people have different views on stuff and they're not coming together around a very clear thing. Like in Hong Kong, you've got, people from all walks of life, from different professions.
There were a bunch of different groups organizing things in Hong Kong too.
Yes, but they were able to figure out, like, here's the specific thing we want. Because you got to understand that, like, the extradition bill is what united people for the first time in many years. You suddenly had a thing where, like, the average person didn't want to be under the thumb of the CCP, but even like the rich bankers were like, I don't want to be extradited to mainland China for all the things that I have done, including a lot of rich people in Hong Kong had kind of been required to do quasi-illegal things like make bribes in China just to do their normal business. But then, like, they can be targeted politically for that. So, like, no one in Hong Kong wanted this. And that's why you were able, for the first time since the umbrella movement, to really unite people around one very specific strategic objective. And in the U.S., it's just such a different situation. Like, I would say in the U.S., you could have united people around a very specific thing, like, charge the police officers with the crime and send them to trial. But of course, that's already happened. So that doesn't make sense as a strategic point.
I think that with the U.S. protests, well, one difference is the Hong Kong protests. Remember when we were in Hong Kong in the first few weeks and people kept kind of expecting the general public broadly to turn against the protesters? Mm-hmm. Like, whenever the protesters escalated a bit, like, there was a fear among both the protesters and the people who were kind of like watching this or like supporting them, but not, in the streets, that like the protesters could go too far and then like turn, the public against them, and the public would support the Hong Kong government. Mm-hmm. And that never happened, partially because the Hong Kong government just kept being worse than the police were just consistently worse than the protesters in every way. So people just kept, like, average Hong Kong people, like, slowly over the course of the summer got more and more radicalized against the police.
Yeah. I mean, really, the Hong Kong police force is at this point just an extension of Beijing at this point.
And that's how they're seen. They're almost, except for the people who support Beijing and support the police, like, most of the Hong Kong public really kind of hates the police now. And I don't think that's happened the same way in the U.S. so far.
Yeah, I mean, among all the cities where there's been, where things have turned violent, like, only in some of them and in a few cases have the U.S. police acted at the level of Hong Kong police. I'm not even clear it's quite at that level, but let's say, even if so, it's a small number of cases, and broadly speaking, that wasn't the case. Like, I saw police arresting people, but it wasn't like police indiscriminately beating people and firing tear gas directly into crowds.
There have been some cases of police firing tear gas.
Right, but it's certainly a spectrum. And I think that you could look at all these cases in the U.S.
Tear gas is a spectrum.
It is a spectrum. Look, tear gas is very unpleasant. But my point isn't that, like, what the U.S. police have done is justified. My point is that you can't point to the U.S. police overall as being one particular way.
Well,
whereas
I mean,
it's much
think,
easier in Hong Kong.
Yeah, although I think that is what the protesters are trying to do in a certain sense. Like,
right.
if you talk about defunding the police, I don't think they're just like defund the Minneapolis police. It's defund the police
right.
as a whole, or abolish the police as a whole.
Mm-hmm. But Hong Kong's not saying that. Hong Kong says independent investigation into police brutality. They're not trying to abolish a police force. So also, like, that is politically a much more reasonable thing to achieve, is independent inquiry versus actually abolishing the police force, which is politically impossible to do in a country.
I mean, I think, well, yes. Also, I think it was interesting, like, President Obama made this Facebook post a few days ago that was basically talking about how, the real way to make change is, while everybody definitely has the right to protest and people should be protesting, like, the real way to make change is to kind of look at local and state elections get involved in local community things, because those are the people who, like, local governments are the ones who negotiate with police unions, about like police conduct, and they're the ones who fund police departments. Like, you kind of have to work at a different level than just like protesting the federal government or something like that.
Right. No, I think Obama makes a very good point. And you know who else understands this point is a lot of the very wealthy people who have super PACs who are funding local elections. Like, we tend to focus on what happens on the national level, but actually it's like you see a lot of these like super PACs, whether it's, George Soros or whoever, and they're specifically targeting like funding a specific candidate for district attorney, or like, local, like it is. That's where our lives really are affected by who's in power in our city, in our county, in our state, and those particular laws. And we the vast majority of criminal charges, for example, are brought at a state level versus a federal level, right? So the laws that control our lives, to the great majority of those laws are actually more local laws than federal things.
Well, there's certainly a lot we could be saying about the protests happening in the U.S., and we're going to be talking a lot about that on our show, America Uncovered. But let's go back to the Chinese Communist Party and how they're using propaganda, turning this into a propaganda mission.
Well, one thing you said earlier that, about how, this is like a windfall, essentially, for the Chinese Communist Party.
A mouse end.
A mouse end, yes. That makes it almost sound cuter than it really is. By the way, did you see that in our episode we have this thing from 1968, like a broadsheet that is about how Comrade Mao Zedong supports the Black Americans, the Afro-American.
Oh, nice. So technically this will come out before that episode.
Maybe. We'll see. At any rate, you were making a point, Shelley, that Mao was supporting African Americans.
Yes, in their fight. It was basically a poster that was about how the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. was actually like a counter-revolutionary violence, because the civil rights, kind of framing the civil rights movement as like part of the class struggle against imperialism.
A communist upheaval.
Yeah, basically.
Right. I mean, there is some historical background for this. Like the Black Panther movement was very much influenced by Marxism and Maoism, and a lot of the Black Panther meetings, people would wave the Mao's Little Red Books, and they would actually use that. I'm not saying that the Black Panther movement was a purely Marxist movement, but I'm saying there was some influence there from Mao.
To complete the circle, like a propaganda video that I watched, and this is actually an example of like a bit more sophisticated propaganda from this Chinese media called Guancha. And it was like a explainer video type of thing about how about the history of race relations in the U.S., like the history of like blacks being oppressed in the U.S. essentially. So it started with like slavery, and then talking about the Civil War, and then talked about the Civil Rights Movement. Kind of implied that maybe the FBI was involved in the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr.
Not the CIA?
No, because J. Edgar Hoover really hated King, like on a personal level, and there are now like documents that the government has released that show how much J. Edgar Hoover hated Martin Luther King Jr. So, the way they put it was kind of like, so the U.S. government or the Federal Bureau of Investigation can't unlink responsibility for King's death or something like that. Like
that's what Chinese state media said.
No, I don't know if Guancha is technically.
That's what the Chinese media said.
This one particular, it's more sophisticated. It's on this show is on like a very popular Chinese social media platform, Bilibili, like very popular video platform, had over 2 million views, and it's like very slick. It's kind of like the John Oliver way of doing it, where like you got a guy and then he's like explaining.
You mean the Chris Chappell way?
The Chris Chappell way of doing it.
Chris Chappell was doing it years before John Oliver.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah.
Just the aesthetic reminded me more of Last Week Tonight. But anyway,
Go on, make your point, Shelley.
okay. So, he sounds reasonable. Like, he talks fast. He doesn't talk in that kind of like state-run media type of, the state,
Yes.
like the Xinwen Lianbo style, where it's kind of like, and like, here's the official pronouncement from, not talking like that. And there's a lot of interesting things. He talked about the Black Panthers, which is why I brought this up originally, where he talked about how there's this Black Panther movement and they were, inspired by Marxism to make it not just a movement for the rights of Black people, but for the rights of women and, all people and whatever. And, sadly, the revolution was not able to come to fruition because of like the Cold War and blah, blah, blah. And that was the closest the U.S. ever came to like socialism.
That's the point it was making.
And it was like, and then like it went on to like make a more sophisticated point about how like you don't have to say that the U.S. has to have socialism, but in a country like the UK where they have the Labour Party, they've been able to give workers more rights and stuff like that. But the U.S. is kind of stuck between the Democratic and Republican parties, both of who are, capitalist parties, like both of who are, parties that are not for the common people. So they're like, we should pity them, actually. That was kind of the, but then they made the point that then the white elites made Black Panther the superhero as a way of like kind of covering up the real glories of the Black Panther movement.
My God.
But like kind of using culture to like cover up like what the Black Panthers actually did.
But there's an inherent problem with that argument,
which is
that Black Panther, the comic book hero, was created before the Black Panther movement.
Yeah, but
accuracy schmaccuracy.
I have to say a lot of the things that they said in that video weren't inaccurate. This is the whole thing where it's like they're making accurate points, but then like here comes the propaganda about like the Marxist Black Panthers who were, trying to implement socialism in the U.S. and,
Right.
It still seems strange to me, like even like one of the founders of Black Lives Matter is openly a Marxist. But then you just look at like the history of countries that were communist, and it never worked out for the people.
Especially the minorities. Like, remember one of the people that we had on this podcast, Dr. Yazegi, was an Albanian Marxist historian. And, that's a great podcast that, I hope people go and listen to. But my point was that, like, he went to China to look at what was happening in Xinjiang to the Uyghurs, thinking that the Western narrative was, like, totally, anti-China. But one of the things he noticed was this extreme racism in China, this Han, he called it like Han superiority, where the Han Chinese wanted to be the ruling class and enslave the ethnically Uyghur people to be the workers and so on. And like, he was so upset by this racism. He's like, this isn't socialism. This isn't the Marxism that China's supposed to have.
Right. They're being bad Marxists.
Yeah.
It's not real communism.
I think if you talk to people who come out of communist countries, like, none of them are Marxists,
No.
like after being through that situation.
But the idea of Marxism is like they look at human history as a history of class struggle, and that the only way forward is to have class struggle. So no matter how good or bad things are in the society, like their approach is to always pit one group against another group and struggle in like a communist sense, which is a much more violent kind of struggle than.
Well, it creates class guilt rather than a person being judged for any of their individual actions. They're judged entirely as a group.
Right. Which is, and if those groups are based on race, then that is specifically racism. If you're judging people, like if you're judging people's character by their race, then that is very problematic.
Yeah, whatever,
Like,
Whitey.
Well, I mean, it's like if you look at what Martin Luther King said, right? That he has I have a dream that one day my children will grow up in a world where people are judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And so if you look at people's character and their, how they treat other people and how they act, Like, you can judge people that way, or you can judge them as part of some group, some arbitrarily created group. And if you break that into race, then you have, racial stereotypes. If you break that into, economic class, and you have those stereotypes. If you break it into gender, you have those stereotypes. But really, like, these are all ways of creating tension rather than actually evaluating people as individuals based on how they treat each other.
That video I watched ended with quoting Martin Luther King Jr. and saying that his dream has still not been, manifested in the U.S.
Well,
Which is another one of those things that is like, well, it's not incorrect.
No.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, well, like, one of the things that, when you talked about it being a mouse end, but, like, it's only that they already had these narratives in play that they could kind of apply them to the situation.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Yeah.
if it wasn't racism as the, original sin, like deeply rooted problem in American society that makes America a hypocrite whenever they try to, judge other countries, it will be something else. Like, with the coronavirus, it was how chaotically Western governments had handled the coronavirus outbreak.
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, that in these current protests around George Floyd's death, another propaganda narrative has been, once again, by the Communist Party, look at how chaotic democracy is.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, that's kind of when people have made jokes about how if you watch the 30-minute, nightly CCTV state-run media newscast, Xinwen it's like the first, 10 minutes are about how great the leaders are. The next 10 minutes are about how great China is. The last 10 minutes are about how chaotic the rest of the world is.
I mean, I actually, this morning I was scrubbing through a whole bunch of like CCTV broadcasts from the past week. Mm-hmm. And like every single one of them was like that. In fact,
yeah,
like,
if you want to see
footage,
the America, you go to the last third.
Right. Like the last, and yeah. Like clockwork. The last third was the protest in America. Next day, protest in America. Next day, protest in America. And as an editor for the video as well, like you have 100 clips to work with, and you end up choosing only 10, right? And what do they choose? They choose the ones that most fit the narrative that they're trying to push, which is that things are super chaotic in the U.S. And so it's not like they necessarily have to lie. All they have to do is be selective about what they say and what they show.
And I mean, they're not going to show, the Flint, Michigan sheriff walking with the protesters.
Right. Right. So
policemen kneeling before the protesters.
Or I've heard some people call that propaganda.
Wow, that's
clever, though.
Clever term.
Yeah, I mean, I think it, like, as a portmanteau, it really...
Wait, but what's the point of that idea? The idea that, like, not all policemen have the same horrible, oppressive view?
No, that, like, they kneel with the protesters, but then they arrest people afterwards or something. Like, the idea that it's like, oh, they only are doing this to look good for the cameras. That's why it's propaganda.
So, like, they're kneeling there and they create the brotherhood and love, and when the protesters come to hug them, that's when they nab them. That makes sense. When I'm a dictator, that's what I'm going to have my policemen do.
Oh yeah, just okay.
You'll have like a 100 flowers movement, but it'll be the 100 hugs movement where everyone's encouraged to hug, but then secretly, like, it's your plot, and then you arrest everybody.
Actually, have you guys seen the video of the police doing the Cupid shuffle?
The
Cupid shuffle,
Cupid.
the dance move.
No, I don't know what this is.
We don't know what this is.
Okay,
Sean.
I mean, it's from 2007, so it's not like
I don't know what Cupid is. I don't know what a shuffle is. None of the words you said made any sense to me.
I mean, it sounds groovy, but I don't know.
You're a cool cat, Matt.
Never mind. You know what? Never mind. We'll just move on.
Look, we got to get on. You got to hop on the trolley. As we now have moved back, I think, at least 100 years in slang.
I'm trying to think older. Gloria Rome. That might be several centuries.
So what about this policeman doing the Cupid shuffle, Shelley?
Never mind. It's a dance that they were doing with the with the people, the protesters, the members of the community. So it was like a nice moment where they were all dancing together. That's all.
Okay, that sounds nice. So you're saying that's not on CCTV?
Weirdly not.
Huh. Yeah. I mean, I think that in television in particular, you have so many choices about what you keep and what you cut, and mostly it's cut, right?
Well,
and so
yeah, I mean, that's what made the America Uncovered episode we did so difficult, because you're trying to like talk about all these different facets of the protests that are all happening, but depending on what you show and what you use, it comes off completely differently.
Oh my God, that episode was so hard to write.
But also, like with video, you also don't necessarily know what happened immediately before or immediately. It's very complicated. But in terms of the propaganda, I would say that like there's this idea of almost weaponizing like a self-flagellation in open societies.
Go on.
Where we talked earlier about how one of the things that kind of trips them up is when you're like, yeah, you're right, we do have racism and it's something that we need to work on, blah blah blah, but it can go kind of too far when then it becomes about how terrible America is, and then it's almost like, well, it kind of weaponizes this, like makes people feel an emotion, like a guilt about America or society, whatever, and then uses that to like how do I put it? Uses that to make it so that you can't say anything about China because America is so terrible. Do you know what I mean?
As a way to silence like individuals?
Yeah, or just like to silence or to make the narrative one of like American imperialism or Western imperialism or American racism, and then it's just about like how terrible America is. And then it's like, well, you're not fit to lead, to be a leader in the world, or like all this kind of
there
stuff.
There should be another superpower, and why not China?
That part's not said.
No, fill in the
but
gaps.
There is kind of, I think, some people I've seen do take it this way, like where it's like, okay, well, American imperialism becomes the worst thing in the world, so then you can't talk about any authoritarian countries because America is the worst. Mm-hmm. So then they end up in like weird positions where they start defending like Chinese authoritarianism in Hong Kong, mm-hmm. because it's anti-imperialist, because China is anti-imperialist because they're against the U.S. Even though what they're basically doing is imperialism to Hong Kong.
Yeah, so it's kind of like the idea of like, anyone who's against Nazis must be good. But like the Soviet Union was against Nazis and they were horrible. It's like things are more complex than they would seem in a propaganda narrative.
Imagine that.
So I think that leads to the final question of this podcast of is this propaganda working? So I want to read a quote from a Global Times article. They're my favorite state-run media, so I like to talk about them. So they had an editorial it was basically based off of something Nancy Pelosi had said about the Hong Kong protest movements. She said it was a beautiful sight to behold. So then the Global Times wrote an editorial saying, watch out, beautiful sight in Hong Kong is spreading across the U.S. So in the article it says, the current situation in the U.S. will not only expose the hypocrisy of many U.S. politicians, but also encourage the American people to rethink their actual national interests. The Communist Party is in a very dangerous spot right now. The international community is furious about Hong Kong, about the coronavirus. Hundreds of thousands of people have died because they covered up a disease. There is a lot of international resentment towards the Chinese Communist Party. They don't want that. They want people to focus on their own internal problems. So, do you think this propaganda narrative is going to be successful at getting Americans to maybe say, hey, you know what, China isn't important. We need to make our own bed first.
I don't know if it'll get people to say that exactly. I don't think it's going to work on U.S. politicians, for one. But I think, that seems to be what you quoted seems to be kind of an explicit threat about the U.S. Taking action on Hong Kong, which it currently is. And I don't think that, these protests are going to stop U.S. government officials from doing what they're already doing with Hong Kong or paying attention to it. I think for American people, for most people, I don't think it will work. I think when we were talking about that whole like self-flagellation thing, I think it does work on some people. The whole idea that like, oh, well, like America's really like not good. And like the whole idea of like America being the worst place, I think that actually is something that you can see in not just Chinese state-run media, but it's carried over to like Western media too. And I'm not saying they got that from Chinese state-run media, but that idea is, I think, like a lot of people do accept that like America is like the worst place, like everybody's oppressed, for different reasons, and like we need to like burn the system down. But and I think that like that kind of stuff is stuff that Chinese propaganda can draw. It's kind of a cycle in which sometimes they influence that, and then you have American experts say those things, and then the Chinese state-run media can quote them saying those things. Like the Chinese state-run media has been quoting Washington Post a lot recently, talking about the protests and how like it exposed like the deeply rooted racism in America and things like that, because it's always good when you get the experts to say it for you, so you don't have to say it yourself. So we see that happen a lot. But I think there's another audience for this propaganda, which is, the main audience, which is Chinese people. And I think that it does work better for Chinese people, this whole propaganda about how chaotic other countries are. Like they actually managed to use the propaganda about how chaotically other countries handled the coronavirus to tamp down a lot of the anger that people were feeling about Dr. Li Wenliang and about some of the things that the Chinese government did to cover up the coronavirus.
Well, as far as we can tell.
As far as we can tell. I think, what we see in response is more from like middle class, upper middle class Chinese people, like more elite Chinese people. We don't really know very accurately how people who are like lower economic classes or in the countryside feel about things, just because it's so censored. So like you kind of see the people who are the dissidents, who have kind of like nothing else to lose. We kind of know how they feel about things, and then we kind of know how the Chinese elites feel about things. But like that middle ground, we don't know a lot about. But it does work on a certain level to reassure people that like, okay, well, we've handled it well, everywhere else isn't, or that like, look at how bad America is at handling their race issues. Like, look at all this chaos, they're trying to almost like just completely like disqualify democracy or like liberal democracies as a like governing
as
system.
In basically trying to convince the Chinese people that, hey, our systems might not be perfect, but it's better than anything else. Please don't tear us down.
Like definitely, like there was a Global Times article that was talking about Chinese people like revenge watching the protests in America. But like the point that the article overall was trying to make is that like now Chinese people are waking up. Now they like, before they didn't really like know that, these protests for democracy or whatever, they were kind of taken in by the whole like freedom and democracy thing. But like now they kind of look at what's happening in the US and they understand like what that really means, so like I do think that messaging is a little bit more successful in terms of like how people think of China now. Like I think more countries are upset with China, but I don't know that all countries are, because you still have like leaders like Angela Merkel who are, like, whoop, yeah, there's no problem with having Huawei 5G. The European Union, they're just like, well, we have to work together. We have to work harder at working together with China. So I don't know that that's overall something that's, I don't think it's like now the rest of the world has completely realized what the Chinese Communist Party is doing. I think there's still some work to be done there.
And I think the media have a big part to play in this as well. Like Western media, of course, the media in any country probably, but certainly in the U.S., has these cycles where once a thing starts to be reported, it gets picked up by all the other media, and then it feeds itself and it loops, right? So, like, the current media cycle is all the U.S. protests, and it's like nothing else really matters.
If it bleeds, it leads.
That's right, and like this, but eventually, like, it's going to go away, and it'll go on to the next horrible thing that happens in 2020, and like
hurricane season.
So, like, I mean, I was thinking it couldn't get any worse, but I'm sure it's going to get worse.
Oh my God, man! Why did you just say that?
I heard there's going to be like 3 lunar eclipses in a single month this year.
Is that
even possible?
It's like hasn't happened in 2,000 years.
How is that possible?
I don't know. I need to fact check this, but I heard on the internet.
Okay.
Anyways, the heavens are aligning themselves against us.
It's this year started out so nicely. Like we were in Taiwan and covering these elections, and it was like democracy, and it was like, wow, like things are going so well. That was like the first 2 weeks of January.
We had a bubble tea pizza. It didn't start out that great.
No, the bubble tea pizza is the moment when it all went downhill.
I think honestly that we should have stayed in Taiwan.
We would have been better off from the coronavirus, though there have been all the threats of invading Taiwan.
Guys, let's just move to Taiwan.
No, because as soon as we do that, then an invasion will happen.
Well, then we'll be on the ground.
Yeah. What's that guy we interviewed? The big guy who said he would fight. Guangzhong.
Yeah.
We can join up with him on the battlefield.
I thought you were going to say hide in his studio while he goes and fights.
Yeah, that's another idea.
No, Guangzhong is great. But at any rate, yeah, no, this year has become far more challenging and chaotic than I thought. But my point was just about like the media cycle, is that because most of people's information either comes directly from the mainstream media or from social media or word of mouth that is based on what people have seen in the mainstream media, that like there's a small number of news organizations that are essentially leading the American current events thinking. And so because of the current protest in the US, it's shifted a lot of the attention away from China. And I don't think that's a good thing. I think we need to keep our attention on China. I think more people need to watch China Uncensored and China Unscripted. But just in general, like the mainstream media have this responsibility to keep talking about what's happening in China, what's happening in Hong Kong, keep investigating the Chinese Communist Party's cover-ups, keep investigating things like potential security risks of 5G. And because of the news cycle, they're not doing that right now, and I think that's irresponsible.
I mean, I think it's not that they're not doing it, but the things that will float to the top or like will get more attention will be involved with the protests and things like that. But, I think actually as the U.S. government keeps doing things related to China, that keeps China in the news cycle.
Yeah.
I mean, I do have to say that one of the things that does disturb me about the news cycle is seeing these messages that are very similar to messages that are in Chinese state-run media.
All right, so give us an example.
Okay, so this is not protest related. This actually has to do with decoupling, or the idea that, China and the U.S. Should, like, economically decouple from each other, right? So in the last 2 weeks, there have been a lot of articles in Chinese state-run media about what a bad idea decoupling is, which means they're really afraid that the U.S. or other countries are going to decouple from China economically, because then who will give them the money that allows them to do all this stuff? So then the other day in the Wall Street Journal, there was an article about how expensive decoupling is going to be for the U.S. And the idea is that, like, you know, the U.S. overestimates or underestimates how much economic pain there will be on Americans because of decoupling. And it's not something that's untrue necessarily, but it does, like, take the same type of, like, stance where, like, you know, decoupling is a bad idea. It has a lot of these things have to do with, like, you know, the, like, reasons that the U.S. shouldn't pull out of the WHO or like a lot of these kind of more international things where Chinese state-run media will talk about the importance of cooperation and something like that, and that will get repeated.
Well, I remember with the trade war, there was a lot of media covering things about like how, oh, the U.S. is the loser in the trade war. The U.S. is going to get creamed. Is this America being great or something? Just generally trashing the whole premise of a trade war. I mean,
I think that, like, there should be discussion about whether it is the right thing to do, sure. But, yeah, there's a lot that, like, because we like kind of contrarian takes or controversial takes in the media, like, we like the person who's doing the devil's advocate thing, or, like, who's going to publish something that makes people, like, be like, really? Like, that kind of leaves it open to a lot of narratives from Chinese propaganda, essentially. Yeah, like this one about from Global Times: UK stands to lose more than China if free trade deal goes through. If the free trade deal falls through. So it's the same idea.
You know what this reminds me of? It reminds me of the argument 20 years ago when the U.S. was like, we should couple our economy with China because, you know, it'll be better for Americans because the prices for goods will go down, and better for Americans because American businesses will make money in China, right? And, like, obviously that was, like, an incredibly short-sighted prospect. And now, like, yeah, if you decouple, there's going to be some pain because businesses have to change and shift and set up new manufacturing elsewhere.
Things might be more expensive.
Yeah, but like if coupling our economy with China has hollowed out the American workforce and subjected American companies to vast amounts of theft, then wouldn't decoupling, like, be the opposite of those things, or at least stop those things?
It's like when you're in a bad relationship and you know it's time to break up.
But you feel really attached and then you don't want to let it go.
It's not easy.
Are you saying we should write an episode about decoupling that compares it to, like, a messy divorce?
Haven't we done that? If not, we should.
I don't think we've done one specifically about decoupling.
It's time for the U.S. and China to break up.
Oh,
Who gets
what was
the kids? Who gets the UK?
The Gwyneth Paltrow and Chris Martin did conscious uncoupling a few years ago. That's how they put it when they got divorced. That, like, they did a press release where they said they were consciously uncoupling.
Wow.
So now we have to consciously decouple.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, hey, something we learned from Gwyneth Paltrow. And hey, on that note, let's wrap up this podcast.
We're all a little tired.
We're all a little tired. It's been a long
It's been a
year.
rough week.
Guys, we should move to Taiwan.
Not totally opposed to that.
Y la famosa. All right. Well, thank you for listening to this episode of China Unscripted Podcast. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Jong.
And I'm Matt Gnezda.
Talk to you next time.